Every person has the right to control his or her own body. They have the right to free will to do whatever they choose, except when and how they die. We have the right to life, so inversely, we should have the right to determine at what time and in what manner we die, whether it be by natural means, by suicide, or by the right to relieve our own suffering through euthanasia. Just as we have a right to control our own bodies, we also have a right to privacy and to our own beliefs. These rights are guaranteed to us by the U.S. Constitution. The freedom of choice is the cornerstone to all democracies. So this alone should give us the option to make our own decisions on whether we live or die. So what happens to us when life becomes excruciating and unbearable? When one of us is diagnosed with an incurable disease and we are literally just wasting away in painful agony, we should have the right to die when our lives become this excruciating and undignified. Our quality of life has been diminished at this point. Death in our future is inevitable. It's always inevitable. We're all going to die sometime. So, in the more humane way, the more humane way is to allow us to choose the manner of our own end and to die with our own dignity. Euthanasia literally means good death, and it is with the consent of the patient who is going through this painful and incurable disease and who wants to die with their own dignity and end their suffering and the suffering of their families. It's as if this nation is wanting to force the right to life on everybody. Some people are so in such pain that they don't want to live. If there is a right to live, then there should be a right to die. We should be able to accept another's choice to die when life itself is nothing but pain and suffering. Additionally, sometimes we have to look at the expense that it has on the family. The expense that the family will incur inevitably, whether the person dies 6 months from now or immediately by euthanasia. We also need to consider whether or not the end product of the treatment gives that person the quality of life that is really worth being forever in debt or leaving their family in debt, such as the person that is in a car accident and is quadriplegic and cannot work. Perhaps taking a euthanasia option, which costs $35 to $45, should be allowed to at least be considered by these people. They should at least have that choice. Yes, it would obviously be emotionally troubling on their family, but then their family would not be left in debt, nor would they have to watch their loved ones suffer. The majority of the proponents of euthanasia are made up of loved ones who have had to watch a family member or friend suffer until the end. So euthanasia should be allowed because we have a right to live, so we ought to have a right to die.
Along with having the explicit right to die, as Amber discussed, euthanasia could also lead to freeing up scarce health resources. It is no secret that in most countries there's a shortage of healthcare resources. This could range anywhere from being completely full and not having an open bed available for the patient on the floor to not having the necessary medical supplies to accurately treat the patient. As a result, some people who are ill and who could be cured are not able to get the speedy access to facilities and materials that they need for treatment. At the same time, health resources are being used on people who cannot be cured and who, for their own reasons, no longer wish to continue living. Allowing such people to commit euthanasia would not only let them have what they want, but it would free valuable resources to treat people who will very likely be able to live. Another aspect to consider is the cost of assisted suicide. It costs $35 to $45 for the shot in the 4 states that is legal in the United States. Those states are Washington, Oregon, Montana, and Vermont. Whereas prolonging life and using extensive and often unnatural life support measures could cost upwards of tens of thousands of dollars. We found that $10,000 is saved per patient by physician-administered euthanasia, and $627 million is saved in all. Although this only represents less than 1% of healthcare expenditures, keep in mind that this involves only 4 states and very few people qualify for assisted suicide. Perhaps this money could be used elsewhere. It could be put towards treating NICU babies and giving them a chance to experience a normal, healthy life, or to an oncology patient who with early treatment could be put into remission, or to a wide variety of other patients. Now, to prevent abuse of this notion, regulations obviously have to be put into place. The use of euthanasia would be limited to people where death is in the imminent, unpreventable future, where we as healthcare providers are essentially just postponing death instead of prolonging life for the patient. The patient would be suffering and in pain with merely no quality of life. Also, a vital aspect of preventing abuse would be by only allowing the person who wanted to die to initiate the process. This puts the decision in the hands of the patient so that it is not ever something that is forced upon them by a healthcare provider. Regulations that rigorously prevent abuse would absolutely be put into place.
Along with Katie and Amber's main points with supporting euthanasia, there's also the point of euthanasia prevents prolonged death and suffering. Life can be prolonged unnaturally, such as with the use of life support and feeding tubes. On the other hand, removing life support and feeding tubes to cause death often results in prolonged, excruciating death. Take example, the Terri Schiavo case. It was determined that her death was imminent and that she would have the right to die. Euthanasia was not an option. Her feeding tubes were removed, and she essentially starved to death. Her feeding tubes were removed on March 18th, but she did not pass away until March 31st. This caused an unnecessary, painful process for her. Terri Schiavo's husband, Michael, witnessed her condition and suffering. Family members watched the slow death of their loved ones, are convinced that the suffering is not necessary, and the law should be altered to include euthanasia. In nearly all countries, a significant amount of people are for euthanasia. A democracy should reflect this will of its own people. Forcing patients to starve to death or go into cardiac arrest simply because the option of euthanasia does not exist is a very cruel alternative. Nowadays, life can be sustained for longer periods with modern technology and techniques. However, when sustaining life becomes excessive exercise in medicine and technology, a cutoff point is necessary. And that cutoff point is euthanasia. Is it more humane for us to allow a person with a terminal illness and suffering to be allowed to choose to end that suffering? If our beloved pet is suffering, do we relieve it? Why should this act of kindness be denied to humans but not animals? Animals don't even choose their death, yet we as humans cannot elect to die via euthanasia. Another case that points to this and supports it is the Nancy Cruson case of 1983, for example, which actually happened in Mount Vernon, Missouri. After her horrible car accident, the paramedics found her to have no vital signs, but resuscitated her. She was in a coma for 3 weeks and was then declared to be in a persistent vegetative state. A feeding tube was inserted to provide long-term care. Her parents wanted to remove her from life support, but the Missouri Department of Health upheld the legal standard that, under the Due Process Clause, competent people are able to exercise the right to refuse medical treatment, since there was no evidence that Nancy wanted of what she wanted followed. Following this decision, Nancy's parents encountered more proof that she would have wanted life support terminated, won a court order, and removed her from life support. She died 11 days later. This was an extremely conflicting situation for Nancy's family, and although they ultimately chose euthanasia, it was what their daughter wanted. So instead of her dying within months of the car accident, which was in 1983, since she had to have the prolonged death process that we put in place in our healthcare system, she ended up dying later at the end of the year of 1990.
While the other side made 3 excellent points, rebutting against that people have the explicit right to die. Yes, we have a right to die, just as we have a right to live, but that does not mean that someone should have to assist you to do so. According to Washington v. Glucksberg, a U.S. Supreme Court majority opinion on June 26, 1997, the asserted right to assistance in committing suicide is not a fundamental liberty interest protected by the Due Process Clause. Our docility and civility are held together by our laws, which prevents the killing of anybody, except for war. We cannot allow people the right to die because it is the first step to being uncivilized. Death is wrong, and when is it a good thing that we slaughter one another for our own society?
To rebuke allowing people to die may free up scarce health resources. Yes, you may free up some resources, such as life support machines and medications, but we have a substantial amount of resources because we have programs such as hospice that are catered specifically towards critical care patients nearing death. From an employment perspective, there might be a backlash in the employment of medical professionals, such as nurses and physicians, due to conflicts of ethical reasons, and reasons for even entering the healthcare field. It's common knowledge that a hospital is a place where people go to heal and seek hope of a healthy future. The cost of treatment and the use of resources, however scarce they are, should not matter. Hospitals strive to do whatever they can in order to keep patients alive. They were created to sustain life, not to purposefully end life. That being said, our obligation is to love our patients for their sake and to care for them even when they are not apparently aware of us. Our duty is to make them as comfortable as possible. We may have to administer pain management that could shorten a person's life due to an undesirable side effect. However, we must accept these circumstances and never eliminate the pain by intentionally eliminating the patient.
To reinforce what Catherine said, our job as healthcare workers is to think of ways to prolong life and promote health, not to find ways to end it. What determines a true euthanasia patient? Sometimes life-saving measures work miracles in patients who, upon admission, appear that their life is nearing death. As a healthcare professional, administering euthanasia is as if we are giving up on the patient and not advocating them to continue fighting for their lives. We aren't instilling the hope that they need from healthcare professionals.
Euthanasia weakens society's respect for the sanctity of life. At one point, this perception of the sanctity of life prevailed in the medical profession. The sanctity of life mentality regards individual human life as holy, sacred, of immeasurable value, regardless of physical and/or mental quality of the person. A human being's age, sex, race, religion, social status, or potential for achievement are insignificant. Therefore, everyone's life is valuable, and we should respect our worth with the continuation of life despite our sufferings. Death does not necessarily imply that the patient does not respect his or her life. You can place a value or price on things, but not on humans who are created by God and who are called by God. Many believers assert that human life is sacred because it's a gift from God, and that the right to decide when a person dies ultimately belongs to him. For these reasons, the deliberate taking of human life should be prohibited except in self-defense or the legitimate defense of others. Today, it seems as though the quality of life mentality is more widespread than that of the sanctity of life. Instead of viewing individual human life as holy, sacred, of immeasurable value, the quality of life mentality places a value on individual human life that is primarily based on its physical and/or mental quality. Just as we value our computers and cars based on their quality, whether they function well or whether they are useful and efficient, we place a price on the product of human life. We ultimately place a higher value on human life that encompasses greater physical and mental quality, and we deem a lesser value on individual human life that is of lesser physical and mental quality. Humans are valued too much for their usefulness, their productivity, their ability to be of some use to society, and are mistakenly not valued for their own sake. With this distorted mentality, many believe that a handicapped child would be of less value than a healthy child.
Going off of Catherine's example of a handicapped child being less valued in our society than a healthy child, accepting euthanasia accepts that some lives, like those of the disabled or sick, are worth less than others. How would this feel to devalue people's lives like this? Some people fear that allowing euthanasia sends the message, it's better to be dead than sick or disabled. The subtext is that some lives are not worth living. Not only does this put the sick or disabled at risk, it also downgrades their status as human beings while they are alive. Think about it from a disabled person's perspective. All people should have equal rights and opportunities to live good, long, healthy lives. Many individuals with disabilities enjoy living, and just because you have a disability does not mean that you are deemed unhealthy. Many individuals without disabilities don't enjoy living, and no one is threatening their lives and how they are choosing to live them. The proper approach to people with disabilities is to provide them with appropriate support, not to end their lives. The quality of a person's life should not be assessed by other people, and people with disabilities should not be assessed without providing proper support first.
Many believe that voluntary euthanasia is the start of a slippery slope that leads to involuntary euthanasia and the killing of people who are thought undesirable. Many people believe that if euthanasia was legalized, it may lead to the slippery slope effect, which could result in non-voluntary or involuntary euthanasia. This argument implies that if we allow something relatively harmless today, we may start a trend that turns into something currently unthinkable becoming accepted. Philosopher David Enoch argues that once we allow voluntary euthanasia, we may or will fail to make the crucial distinction, and then we will make the morally unacceptable outcome of allowing involuntary euthanasia. Or perhaps even though we may make the relevant distinction, we will not act accordingly for some reason, perhaps a political reason or a reason that has to do with weakness of will or some other reason. There are several historical examples of euthanasia and the slippery slope effect, particularly the Nazis' Action T4 during the Nuremberg trials and the Groningen Protocol in the Netherlands. Action T4 was a euthanasia program where physicians murdered countless people who were deemed incurably sick by medical examination. Over 70,000 people were killed during the official genocide period. The Groningen Protocol is a document that was created to assist with the decision-making process when one must consider whether or not to actively end the life of a newborn or child euthanasia. The text provides a legal framework for assessing the situation. It states that only the parents may initiate the procedure, but the physician and social worker must agree to it and attest to the child's unbearable suffering. Those who oppose this argument say that properly drafted legislation can draw a firm barrier across the slippery slope. However, I believe that this is not fully possible because there may be situations when a doctor or nurse is unable to obtain drafted legislations, particularly if the patient has a stroke or goes into a coma. This idea is upheld in Eugene Volok's article, The Mechanism of a Slippery Slope. According to him, judicial logic may eventually lead to a gradual break in the legal restrictions for euthanasia. Lastly, many people worry that if voluntary euthanasia were to become legal in the United States, it would not be long before doctors become rash about whether or not to administer a euthanasia shot. It may become a normal occurrence as their viewpoint becomes more apathetic.
To rebuke Catherine's claim that euthanasia weakens society's respect for sanctity of life, nowadays there really is no sanctity of life. This is a very biblical, conservative, and metaphorical thought. Let's be honest, there's never really been a true sanctity of life in societies. There have always been justified killings, there's always been death penalties, beheadings, genocides, murders, and innocent soldiers dying in war. And we're not talking about involuntarily killing disabled people. We're talking about people who are suffering, who voluntarily choose to die. And as far as talking about involuntary killing, I mean, many people are for abortion. It's legal in this country. That's killing a human being, according to some, against its will before it's even born. In this instance, the person's making that decision for another life. In euthanasia, the person's making that decision to die for themselves. God gave us free will. We should be allowed to use it as we see fit. And since we're talking about the religious side of things, did not God make all creatures? We euthanize our beloved pets so they don't suffer. It's considered a kindness when we do this, putting them out of their misery. Why shouldn't God's most beloved creatures, who he made in his own image, not be extended the same courtesy? Done.
To rebuke the point that accepting euthanasia accepts that some lives, those of disabled or sick, are worth less than others, it's not a matter of accepting or believing whether lives are worth more or less than others, but accepting the fact that someone is dying, life is ending, and that there is no escape of it, except for by a physician ending the suffering. Many of these people are horribly ill or severely injured, but we fear the thought of death so much and prefer to rather extend the person's dying process. Also, we're not categorizing these people as worth less than others due to the fact that this is a voluntary option. We are not choosing for them.
I'd like to comment in response to the notion that voluntary euthanasia is the start of a slippery slope that leads to involuntary euthanasia and the killing of people who are thought to be undesirable. As previously mentioned, there have to be regulations to euthanasia. Euthanasia should only be administered to someone who is going to die, not someone who merely wants to die but is not nearing death. This is to be thought of as a method that is to be used with the patient's consent. It would prevent unnecessary pain and suffering for the patient when his or her life is thought to be prolonged unnaturally with life support measures. The use of euthanasia does not discount patients or label them undesirable. It merely respects the wishes of the patient in regards to their end-of-life care.
It is entirely possible to regulate euthanasia. There's no reason why euthanasia cannot be controlled by proper regulation. Some fear that regulations cannot stop people who want to implement involuntary euthanasia for bad motives. This could be true, but that's not much different from a position of any crime. The law prohibits murder, but people are still out there murdering. There are laws against stealing, but people, break into things and steal every day. Nonetheless, people worry that whatever regulations are put into place, they won't stop patients, particularly vulnerable ones, being pressured to choose death when they would rather live for a few more weeks. This is why regulations are put into place. 4 states currently have death with dignity laws: Oregon, Washington, Vermont, and Montana. These states have regulations that attempt to ensure that death is the patient's choice, with multiple ways to opt out and without outside pressure. Several safeguards in death with dignity laws ensure patients are protected, and if they wish to use the law, they're in full control of the process. These safeguards and the request process ensure that there's little chance patients are coerced to hasten their deaths. Terminally ill patients who wish to obtain a prescription under these laws must be a resident of one of the 4 states and follows a series of steps in order to be certified. Among other requirements, the patient has to be a resident of one of the states, capable of making and communicating healthcare decisions for themselves. They have to be diagnosed with a terminal illness with less than 6 months to live, and 2 physicians must determine whether these criteria have been met. To die by euthanasia, the person must also do the following. First, they make a first request to the physician. Then they have to wait 15 days, and they make a second oral request to the physician. Then they have to make a written request to the physician, which must be witnessed by 2 individuals who are not primary healthcare providers or family members. They can rescind this request at any time, and then they have to wait 48 hours again before they can pick up the prescription from the pharmacy. And once they pick up the prescription from the pharmacy, they must be able to administer or ingest the prescribed medication themselves. The law further requires the intending physician must be licensed in the same state as the patient. The diagnosis must be certified by a consulting physician who must also certify that the patient is mentally competent to make and communicate healthcare decisions. And if either physician determines that the patient's judgment is impaired, the patient must be referred for a psychological evaluation. The attending physician must inform the patient of alternatives, including palliative care, hospice, and pain management options. And the attending physician must request that the patient notify their next of kin of their decision. Use of the law cannot affect the status of the patient's health or life insurance policies. So see, this is one way that they're regulating euthanasia. This has many outs for the patient if they choose not to do it, but it gives them that choice. If they have found a way to aid people with their right to die and attempt to prevent the abuse of it by others, it shows that there is a way to give people a choice to have death with dignity.
A separate right to die is not necessary because our other human rights imply the right to die. With life comes death. So how can laws be implemented about life yet necessitate a separate law about death? Why do there have to be two laws about life and death when death is in fact a part of life? People have the right to try and make the events in their lives as good as possible, so they have the right to try to make their dying process as good or as comfortable as possible. If the dying process is unpleasant, people should have the right to shorten it and thus reduce the unpleasantness. It's their life, isn't it? But even if there is a right to die, that doesn't mean that doctors have a duty to kill. So no doctor can be forced to help the patient who wants euthanasia. So in this case, the doctors are also given a choice. No one is forced to do anything.
Death is a private matter, and if there is no harm to others, the state and other people should have no right to interfere. If an action promotes the best interests for everyone concerned and violates nobody's rights, then that action is morally acceptable. In some cases, euthanasia promotes the best interests of everyone involved and violates no one's rights. It therefore is morally acceptable. Death will always be a sensitive subject for people. It is never easy to lose a loved one or to see them go through immense pain and suffering. People will always be hurt by death and miss their loved ones, no matter how the death occurs. The difference with euthanasia is that the patient will suffer less, and the friends and family do not have to witness the patient's suffering for as long.
To rebut the statement that it is possible to regulate euthanasia, there are specific circumstances when there might not be time to sort through lists of rules that regulate euthanasia. What if the patient goes into a coma and is unable to respond? What if the patient has a stroke and is in a persistent vegetative state? There will always be a gray area, and every case is different and should be handled individually. It's difficult to regulate something that is so unique to each patient and their condition.
To rebuke the statement that a separate right to die is necessary because our human rights imply the right to die, if you want to die and are a normal, healthy person, you have every right to end your life. If someone is dying, they are already going to die, and the physicians are making the process quicker and less painful.
To rebut the statement that death is a private matter and if there's no harm to others, the state and other people have no right to interfere. Yes, death is a private matter, but you are introducing an outside party to your death. Not only is this difficult for family and friends, but it's psychologically destructive to many doctors and nurses that are trying to keep their patients alive as long as they can, yet they're told to do something completely opposite than what they've learned about medical practice.
Euthanasia might not be in a person's best interest. A serious problem for supporters of euthanasia are the number of cases in which a patient may ask for euthanasia or feel obliged to ask for it when it isn't in their best interest. Some examples follow. What if the diagnosis is wrong and the patient is not terminally ill? Or the prognosis, the doctor's prediction as to how the disease will progress, is wrong and the patient is not going to die soon? What if the patient is getting bad medical care and their suffering could be relieved by other means? A patient's request for euthanasia could be seen as a cry for help, implying that life is not worth living now, but could be worth living if various symptoms of fear were managed. What if the patient is depressed and believes that things are so much worse than they actually are? And then thinking about the state of the patient, what if the patient is confused and not able to make judgments themselves that are sensible? What if they're feeling vulnerable or that they are going to be a burden on their family and loved ones? What if they're worried they don't know the pain that they are about to endure and it might seem unrealistic? And lastly, what if the patient doesn't have the resources or people to help take care of them? However, that might be stressful, but in no way is a means to end their life.
Our final point is that euthanasia affects other people's rights, not just those of the patient. Euthanasia is usually viewed from the viewpoint of the person who wants to die, but it affects other people too, and their rights should be considered. Many euthanasia opponents believe that establishing an option of assisted suicide or euthanasia would have negative consequences not only for the patients who receive assisted dying, but for many others. Take into consideration family and friends. Conflict often arises due to differing opinions and beliefs of various family members. A family member or friend with an enduring power of attorney or who has been appointed guardian may face battles about continuing, withholding, or withdrawing medical treatment. When decisions are made and carried out without family consultation and/or agreement, the resulting bitterness may split a family apart, sometimes forever. Let's also look at the situation of a euthanasia patient's family. After Rebecca Badger, one of Dr. Kevorkian's clients, killed herself, her daughter Chrissy discovered the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis was wrong. The autopsy showed that her mother did not have multiple sclerosis, and if she had sought a second opinion instead of assisted suicide, she might still be alive today. Chrissy describes the Kevorkian suicide experience and what has followed in one word: overwhelming. Euthanasia also affects medical and other healthcare professionals. Many medical and healthcare professionals may technically be pro-euthanasia, but when it comes down to be the one to administer the dose in the moment, could he or she actually administer it? It appears that this could be psychologically challenging for many professionals, most notably because making someone die is hardly a form of medical assistance. It is essentially anti-medical. A report was published by the UK Voluntary Euthanasia Society on the 9th of September 2003, stating that 30% of suspects in reported mercy killing cases ended up committing suicide. The chief executive of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, Deborah Annetz, is quoted as saying, "Behind the statistic of 30% of mercy killers going on to commit suicide, there lies a huge amount of suffering." Ms. Annett's interpretation of the statistic is that mercy killers commit suicide because they're fearful of prosecution. To them, it seems just as likely that the person who has assisted a loved one to die may have begun to suffer guilt, remorse, and despair. Other people in a similar situation who may be pressured by the decision of this patient and society in general are also affected by euthanasia.
Thanks for watching our ethical euthanasia debate.
We hope you learned a little bit more about this topic in the meantime.
Thanks.